Let me tell you about a buddy of mine. And then he saw something he never could have anticipated. His wife, alone in a room with another man. In that moment, he uncovered a truth so terrifying, it explained everything. The reason they had never been able to have children. Brian's fingers tightened around the doorknob as he paused, taking a deep, steadying breath before finally pushing the front door open. From the living room, a faint murmur of voices drifted toward him. Something about the tone was off, low and tense, as though secrets were being traded. Stepping inside, Brian's eyes immediately landed on Charlotte, seated at the kitchen table with her closest friends, Marin, Poppy, and Ivy. The women were huddled together, speaking in hushed tones that abruptly ceased the moment he entered the room. Charlotte stood to greet him, her smile warm yet tinged with something almost playful, mischievous, even. The air shifted palpably, and Brian's instincts told him that whatever they'd been discussing was something significant. But what? Charlotte, never one to shy away from sharing her thoughts, broke the silence in her typical breezy fashion. I've been thinking about hosting a partner-sharing party, she announced as casually as if she were suggesting a backyard barbecue. The words hung heavy in the air, reverberating in Brian's mind. A chill crept through his chest as he struggled to process what he just heard. Marin lit up, her fingers flying over her phone as though the announcement were an invitation to action, while Poppy and Ivy exchanged hesitant glances. Brian's heartbeat quickened as Charlotte continued, her voice calm, almost too calm, as though she'd rehearsed this moment. It's a simple idea, she explained, her eyes locking onto his. Guests can bring a partner or come solo. There are no strict rules, just the freedom to explore and swap partners if people feel comfortable. Her gaze stayed steady, gleaming with a mixture of anticipation and challenge. She was waiting for his reaction, and he could feel the weight of her unspoken expectations. His stomach sank. Wait, are you serious? His voice emerged as little more than a whisper, as though saying it aloud might somehow make it real. Charlotte's smile remained unshaken, her calm demeanor almost unnerving. Absolutely, she replied, her tone unwavering. I've been considering this for a while. Of course, you're not obligated to do anything you don't want to, she added. But the way she said it didn't reassure him. Instead, her words left Brian grappling with the bigger question. What did this mean for them, for their marriage? His eyes darted to the other women. Marin nodded enthusiastically, her phone still in hand, already brainstorming ideas. It's going to be amazing, Brian, she chirped, her smile dazzling. Just a night for people to relax and have fun. No pressure, no judgment. Poppy, meanwhile, shifted uneasily in her chair, her fingers tapping an uncertain rhythm against the table. Her expression betrayed a mix of hesitation and curiosity. Ivy, ever the pragmatic one, raised the more pressing questions. What about boundaries? What happens if someone isn't comfortable? How do you handle that? Her tone was calm, but carried a faint note of concern. Brian's thoughts raced. You're planning on inviting people into our home, strangers even, and you expect me to just go along with it? His voice wavered, though he tried to sound firm. Charlotte's expression softened, but there was a trace of condescension in her smile, as though she were humoring him. It's not about strangers, Brian, she said gently. It's about trust. It's about us, exploring something new together. This is something I want, and I want you to be part of it. Her words hit him like a wave. Trust. He had always trusted her, but now that trust felt fragile, stretched thin by her unexpected proposal. This wasn't just about trying something new. It was about Charlotte revealing a side of herself he'd never seen before. The conversation continued, with Charlotte diving into the logistics, setting a date, sending invitations, emphasizing that no one would be pressured into anything. As she spoke, Brian felt increasingly alienated. The more she planned, the more surreal it all felt, like he was watching someone else's life unfold. Words like freedom, exploration, and trust flowed effortlessly from her lips, but to Brian, they sounded like cracks forming in the foundation of their relationship. Marin, as bubbly as ever, leaned forward eagerly. I'm already planning the outfits, she said with a laugh. This is going to be wild, completely unforgettable. Her excitement was contagious to everyone except Brian, who felt as though the ground beneath him was crumbling. Poppy's subdued voice broke through Marin's exuberance. "I don't know," she murmured, twirling her drink in her hands. "It's just so different. What if it doesn't feel right?" Her words were tinged with apprehension, but there was something else in her tone, too, an undercurrent of curiosity she couldn't quite suppress. Ivy, ever rational, chimed in again. "We need to be very clear about boundaries," she said firmly. "No misunderstandings, and everyone has to be honest about what they're comfortable with." Ivan, as she spoke with caution, a flicker of excitement betrayed her. She wasn't entirely sold, but she couldn't deny the intrigue. Brian's gaze swept over the room. He couldn't understand how everyone else seemed so at ease with such a radical idea. He thought he knew these women well, but now it seemed like strangers sat before him, each revealing desires and fears he'd never imagined. And Charlotte was the greatest mystery of all. Sensing his discomfort, she turned to him again. "Brian, I can't do this without you," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "This isn't just about them, it's about us. We're in control. It's about trust." Her words echoed in his mind, but the more she spoke, the more he felt cornered. He had always trusted her, but was this too much? Was this the line he couldn't cross? As the evening wore on, Brian felt the weight of the situation crushing him. Excusing himself, he retreated to his study, desperate for space to think. The sound of laughter and animated conversation from the living room seeped through the walls, but it felt distant, like it belonged to another world. Sitting at his desk, he opened his laptop, hoping for a distraction, but his thoughts refused to quiet. Images of Charlotte and her friends planning the party looped endlessly in his mind. How had they reached this point? Had something about Charlotte changed? Or had this part of her always been there, hidden just below the surface? His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his spiral. It was a message from his best friend, Matt. "Hey man, just heard about Charlotte's party. You guys have always been so open-minded, right? Might be worth trying. You never know, you might actually like it." Matt, the adventurous one, always the first to push boundaries. For a moment, Brian felt a pang of envy for his friend's carefree outlook, but mostly, he felt frustration. How could Matt treat this so casually? Did no one else see what was at stake? Matt seemed perfectly at ease with the idea, didn't he? Maybe Brian was overthinking this, complicating it far more than necessary. Brian's thoughts churned. Why am I making this so difficult? It's just a party, right? Just people having fun. So why does it feel like my whole world is teetering on the edge? Why can't I shake this fear? What if this is the thing that changes everything? The more he mulled it over, the deeper his conflict became. He wanted to trust Charlotte, to believe in her judgment, but there was something primal clawing at him, warning him that this could all spiral out of control. Could he stop it? And if he did, would that create a rift between them that could never be repaired? As the evening wore on, Brian's unease only deepened. Charlotte, seemingly oblivious to his growing anxiety, busied herself with preparations. Her excitement was infectious, at least to everyone else. She was meticulously organizing every detail, from the guest list to the decor, to the food. It was obvious how much this meant to her. Later that night, they sat in the bedroom together. Charlotte leaned back against the headboard, her expression serene, her eyes bright with anticipation. Brian perched on the edge of the bed, his hands tightly clasped in his lap. "I just don't get it, Charlotte," he said at last, his voice low and hesitant. "Why is this so important to you? What are you really hoping to get out of it?" Charlotte's expression shifted slightly, empathy flickered across her face, but beneath it was something sharper, something he couldn't quite name. "It's about us, Brian," she said, her tone calm but laced with urgency. "I want us to break out of the routine we've fallen into, to push past the walls we've built around ourselves. We've been so comfortable for so long, and maybe that's the problem. I don't want us to get bored. I don't want to look back one day and regret not trying something new." Her words landed like a blow. Brian stared at her, struggling to reconcile this version of Charlotte with the woman he thought he knew. "I thought we were happy," he blurted out, the words escaping before he could stop them. This feels like you're trying to fix something that isn't broken." Charlotte's gaze softened, but there was a hint of sadness behind her eyes. "It's not about fixing anything," she said gently. "It's about growing, evolving, experiencing life in new ways. You can't hold on to the past forever." She reached out to take his hand, but Brian instinctively pulled away. The gesture felt too much like an invasion, a boundary he wasn't ready to let her cross. Brian could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. What if she was right? What if this really was the only way to move forward? He searched her face, looking for a glimpse of the woman he thought he'd married. But all he saw was a stranger, someone with desires so foreign to him that he wasn't sure he could ever catch up. In the days that followed, Brian grew increasingly restless. Charlotte threw herself into the final preparations for the party, but he couldn't shake the gnawing sense of dread. The closer the event loomed, the more consumed he became by his fears. What if something went wrong? What if someone crossed a line? What if Charlotte was pushing him into something he wasn't ready for? Late one night, his phone buzzed. The message was from Poppy. It was short, simple, but devastating. "Brian, I think you need to know something. I overheard Charlotte talking to Marin about the party. She mentioned that she might be open to exploring with someone else once the night is over." Brian's chest tightened as he read the words. He stared at the message, rereading it over and over. He thought the party was about freedom, a shared experience, something they'd navigate together. But now it seemed Charlotte had an agenda he hadn't been privy to. Without thinking, Brian dialed Poppy's number. When she answered, his voice was tight and urgent. "What exactly did you hear, Poppy? What did she say?" There was a pause on the other end. "I don't know, Brian," Poppy said hesitantly. It didn't feel right. The way she was talking about it, it sounded like she's planning something that's not just about the party." He hung up feeling more alone than ever, as though he were standing on the outside looking in on his own life. Was this all just a game to Charlotte? Does she want to be with someone else? Brian felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between stepping forward into the unknown or retreating to the safety of what he knew. But the party was fast approaching, and with it, the inevitability that his life was about to change forever. Brian's marriage, and his trust in Charlotte, teeters on the brink. As the night of the party finally arrives, an overwhelming dread grips him. He can't escape the feeling that he's walking straight into a nightmare of his own creation. Charlotte had done everything to prepare, curating the guest list, perfecting the ambience, and weaving a sense of freedom and trust into every detail. But none of it mattered to Brian. All he could feel was the storm raging within him, a turmoil he couldn't ignore. His home, once a place of comfort, now felt like the epicenter of disaster. The guests began to arrive. Some were strangers, others acquaintances, and a few familiar faces from Charlotte's circle. They mingled with ease, laughing and chatting as though this was just another party. To Brian, their carefree demeanor only heightened his unease. Standing off to the side, he watched them, feeling completely out of place. Charlotte, however, was in her element. She glided through the crowd with a radiant energy, greeting everyone with warmth and charm. She was animated, alive in a way Brian hadn't seen in her for a long time. When their eyes met, she smiled at him, a smile that sent his heart racing. There was something behind it, something unfamiliar. Her confidence was unsettling, a stark contrast to his own spiraling emotions. Brian's best friend, Matt, who had been the most supportive of Charlotte's idea for the party, seemed to take the whole thing to another level. As the night progressed, he started flirting with Charlotte in a way that Brian could never have expected. His playful remarks, lingering touches, and suggestive comments about stealing a private moment together made Brian's stomach churn. Matt had always been the adventurous one, but seeing him so openly flirt with Charlotte, in front of everyone, shattered Brian's trust in him. Doubt started to cloud Brian's mind. Was this just harmless fun to Matt, or was there something deeper going on? The realization hit him like a wave. His closest friend wasn't just supporting Charlotte's choices, he was actively pursuing her. This revelation turned what was supposed to be a carefree evening into the breaking point of his relationship with Matt. Brian's frustration had reached its boiling point. The flirtation, the casual touches. It wasn't just harmless fun anymore. It was something more, something that felt like betrayal. He stormed over to Matt, his anger bubbling up as his voice cracked the tension in the room. "What the hell is going on with you, Matt?" Brian's voice was tight, the words barely coming out as he fought to keep his cool. Matt just shrugged, a smirk on his face as if he didn't understand the gravity of the situation. "Relax, man. It's just a party. We're all having fun. No harm done." Brian's heart raced, and his hands balled into fists. "No harm done? Are you kidding me?" He spat. "You've been making suggestive comments, getting way too close to her. What the hell do you think you're doing?" Matt let out a short laugh, trying to brush it off. "I'm just being friendly, Brian. She's not off limits, you know. You're the one who said this was about exploring and having fun, right?" The word stung. It was like Matt had no idea how far he'd crossed, as if he thought everything was a game. Brian's jaw clenched, his frustration mounting with every passing second. "Yeah, but there's a line, Matt. Flirting with my wife. Hitting on her in front of me? That's crossing it," Brian said, his voice low but trembling with anger. "You've been my best friend for years, and now you're acting like this? What's wrong with you?" Matt shifted uncomfortably, his casual attitude faltering for a second. "Come on, it's just harmless fun. You're making a big deal out of nothing." Brian's patience snapped. "No, it's not harmless fun. It's disrespectful. It's like you're trying to push boundaries just because you think you can. And what? You think I don't notice? I saw the way you were looking at her." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Matt's face twitched, his cocky grin slowly fading. He stepped back slightly, now on the defensive. "Brian, you need to chill. I'm not trying to steal her away or anything. You're being way too sensitive about this." Brian shook his head slowly, the hurt sinking deeper with each word. "I can't believe you. I trusted you, man. But now I'm seeing you for what you really are. This is more than just a party to you, isn't it? You're pushing me to the edge with this. Maybe I was wrong about you." Matt's eyes flashed, guilt briefly flickering across his face before he masked it with a shrug. "Okay, maybe I went a little too far. But it's not like that, Brian. You know that." Brian's eyes narrowed, his fists still clenched. "No, I don't know that anymore. You've made your move, Matt. You've shown your true colors tonight. I can't just ignore that." Matt ran a hand through his hair, frustration growing as he took a step back. "Look, Brian, I didn't mean for things to go like this. But if you're going to make it all about me, maybe it's time we rethink things. I'm not the problem here." Brian shook his head, his heart heavy with disappointment. "You're damn right. You're part of the problem. I need space from you, Matt. You've gone too far." Without waiting for a response, Brian turned on his heel, the finality of his words echoing in the space between them. He felt the weight of it all, the anger, the hurt, the betrayal, pressing down on him as he walked away. The friendship he'd thought was unbreakable now felt like a fragile shell, ready to crack at any moment. And behind him, Matt stood motionless, his presence only a reminder of how everything had changed. She leaned close as she passed Brian, her voice low and coaxing. "Brian, relax," she whispered, her hand brushing his arm. "Just enjoy the night. If it doesn't feel right, we can leave whenever you want. But tonight is about letting go. Don't overthink it." But how could he not overthink it? Yet he stayed, out of loyalty, out of love, and out of a desperate hope that he might be wrong. That maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. As the evening wore on, Brian became acutely aware of every detail. The music that felt too loud, the laughter that felt too free. Charlotte moved effortlessly among the guests, her laugh ringing out like a melody. She seemed to know everyone, as if these were lifelong friends instead of people who, just days ago, had been strangers. But it wasn't her ease that unnerved him the most. It was the way her eyes kept darting toward the door, as though she were waiting for someone. Someone specific. The night continued, and Brian felt himself sinking deeper into isolation. Around him, the room buzzed with a kind of energy he couldn't match. People paired off, some mingling discreetly in corners, others lingering by the refreshments, whispering in hushed tones. Brian felt like a shadow in the room, an outsider in his own life. By midnight, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The conversations grew quieter, the movements more deliberate. There was a palpable anticipation in the air, a sense that the night was on the cusp of something Brian couldn't bring himself to name. He stood frozen as Charlotte finally made her way toward him, her cheeks flushed and her eyes bright. She leaned in, her voice soft. "Brian, I'm so glad you're here," she murmured, her lips brushing his cheek. "You've been so quiet tonight. Are you enjoying yourself?" Brian didn't respond immediately. "I don't think I am, Charlotte," he said at last, his voice quiet but firm. "I can't do this. I can't stand here pretending everything's fine while you're out there with them." For a moment, Charlotte's expression faltered. "Brian," she said, her tone sharp with frustration, "you knew what this was. You knew what I wanted. This isn't about anyone else. It's about us. About exploring, about being free. I don't understand why you're fighting me on this." Brian felt the walls of the room close in around him. It wasn't the party or the strangers that suffocated him. It was Charlotte, the woman he thought he knew. And yet, here she stood, distant and unreachable, a stranger in every sense of the word. "Maybe this isn't what I want," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Brian looked at Charlotte, searching for something, anything, that could tether him back to the woman he once knew. She turned away and walked toward the others, her steps light, her focus elsewhere. Brian stood frozen, rooted in place as she slipped further into the night's allure. Her laughter rang out across the room, blending seamlessly with the guests' chatter, but to Brian, it sounded hollow. The guests had grown bolder as the evening progressed. Subtle glances turned to flirtatious whispers, and quiet conversations carried an unmistakable undertone of something more. Brian stayed on the edges, observing it all. Hours passed, and Charlotte finally reappeared before him. She was radiant, her cheeks flushed, her laughter easy. She was speaking to another guest, a man Brian didn't recognize. The sight made his stomach twist. The way she tilted her head, the way her body leaned just slightly toward the man. It was a familiarity Brian hadn't seen directed at him in a long time. And yet, even in the midst of her conversation, Charlotte's eyes sought him out. When their gazes locked, he saw something flicker in her expression. Regret? Hesitation? He couldn't be sure, but the moment passed quickly. "Brian," she called out to him, her voice light, almost teasing. "I've been waiting for you to come join us. It's time to let go, to enjoy the night. There's no need to be so tense." Her words were meant to reassure, but they had the opposite effect. To Brian, they only widened the growing chasm between them. He struggled to respond, his thoughts churning. "This isn't Charlotte. This isn't my wife. She's someone else tonight. Someone I don't know." Charlotte waited for him to say something, but when he didn't, she sighed softly and turned back to the crowd, leaving him standing alone once again. Charlotte had often been glancing toward the door, her eyes flickering with a kind of quiet anticipation, as if she were waiting for someone. And now, that moment had arrived. A man walked through the door, Mark. He was a figure from Charlotte's past, someone who seemed to know too much about her, someone who made Brian uneasy the moment he laid eyes on him. Mark's arrival was like a spark in the room, his presence shifting the atmosphere in a way that was almost palpable. It didn't take long for Brian to realize that Mark wasn't just another guest. There was something more to him, something that felt deeply personal. The way Charlotte's gaze lingered on him when he entered, the way she smiled, it was clear there was history between them. History that Brian didn't know about. Mark wasn't just another acquaintance. As the evening wore on, it became obvious that he was someone who knew Charlotte better than Brian ever had, and his familiarity with her was unsettling. They spoke in low tones, their conversations almost too comfortable, as though they had shared things that Brian was completely unaware of. At first, it was little things, a look exchanged between Charlotte and Mark, a laugh that only the two of them seemed to understand. But then, as the night unfolded, Mark let something slip. It was a casual remark at first, almost buried in the conversation, but it hit Brian like a punch to the gut. Mark mentioned something about the pregnancy, Charlotte's pregnancy, the one she had with him years ago. Brian's heart stopped for a moment as Mark spoke, oblivious to the weight of his words. "I guess it's a good thing we never went through with it, huh?" he said, his voice light, as if discussing an old joke. But to Brian, it was anything but. The words felt like a revelation, something so deep and hidden that it shook him to his core. Charlotte had never mentioned it. Not to him, not to anyone, it seemed. It didn't take long for Brian to piece together the fragments of the conversation. Mark had been with Charlotte years ago, during a time when they were still in school, before Brian had even come into the picture. They had shared something important, something that would have forever changed Charlotte's life, and perhaps Brian's as well. Charlotte had been pregnant, and she'd made the decision to have an abortion, a decision that had come with complications. The aftermath of that experience was why, in the years they'd been married, Charlotte and Brian never had children. The realization was like a sharp, painful edge slicing through the veil of trust Brian had built with Charlotte. He thought he knew her, thought he understood everything about their life together. But this revelation, that she had never shared this with him, that there was a part of her life, a part of her heart, locked away, left him reeling. Mark's presence, his casual familiarity with Charlotte, had brought all of this crashing down on Brian in a single moment. The man who had once been her first love now seemed to know more about Charlotte's motivations, her past, and her deepest secrets than Brian ever would. He was in shock, his mind struggling to process what he had just learned. The weight of her confession hit him like a sledgehammer. All these years, he had blamed everything else, timing, circumstances, even his own inadequacies. But never once had he imagined that the reason they never had children was tied to something so painful, so hidden. The abortion, the complications, the silence. He felt betrayed, not just by her, but by the fact that she had kept this secret from him for so long. How could she have kept this from him? How could she have let him live in the dark all these years? What else was there that he didn't know? Desperate for a moment to breathe, Brian stepped into the hallway. The noise of the party dimmed slightly, but before he could collect himself, a voice called out to him. Urgent, familiar. "Brian, we need to talk." He turned to see Poppy standing at the end of the hallway, her expression serious. She glanced toward the main room, where the party was still in full swing, before looking back at him. "I couldn't just watch anymore," she said, her voice low but firm. "I know what's happening, and I think you do too." Poppy hesitated, her eyes darting around before she stepped closer. "Charlotte," she said quietly, "she's not just here for the party. I overheard her talking to Marin earlier. She's already made up her mind, Brian. She's done with you. This was never about exploring. It was about ending things." The rest of the night passed in a blur. Brian wandered aimlessly. While Brian wandered the streets, his mind swirling with the unsettling revelations about Charlotte and Mark, things in the house were unfolding in a way that deepened the chasm between him and his wife. Charlotte and Mark had quietly excused themselves to a room, their intentions unclear, but the private nature of their retreat spoke volumes. They spent their time there in private, wrapped in the sheets, a stark contrast to the tension Brian felt outside. When Brian finally returned home, the weight of his anger and confusion had reached a breaking point. He entered the house quietly, but the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. There, in the room, were Charlotte and Mark, still together, their connection undeniable. The scene hit him like a punch in the gut. He stood frozen for a moment, his thoughts racing, before he finally spoke, his voice trembling with a mix of hurt and rage. "Is this what it's come to, Charlotte?" Brian's voice was low, but the anger was unmistakable. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on her. "All these years, and now I find you wrapped up in his arms again. After everything He couldn't finish the sentence. The pain of it all was too much. Charlotte looked at him, her face softening for a moment, but the calmness didn't last. Mark, who had been silent until now, shifted uncomfortably, sensing the brewing storm in the room. But it wasn't Mark who Brian focused on, it was Charlotte. His eyes were filled with betrayal, his voice thick with emotion as he continued. "Because of you," he spat, "I don't have children. I never even got to have a family with you. You never told me about what happened with Mark. You never told me about the abortion. The one that's kept us from having the life we should have had. His words hung heavy in the air, each one punctuated by the weight of the truth. And now, you've gone and done this. You've betrayed me, Charlotte. The flood of emotions rushed forward, overwhelming him. I can't do this anymore, he said, his voice thick with finality. I'm done. I'm filing for a divorce. The words were out before he could even fully process them. Divorce. The thought had never seemed real until now. But standing there, seeing the woman he loved, the woman he thought he knew, entangled with someone else, someone who had been a part of her life before him, it became painfully clear. The foundation of their marriage had shattered, and he couldn't find a way to rebuild it.